Hi, my name is Chris, and I work in the R&D department here at Pro-M Racing. Today we're going to talk about the proper way to install an intake manifold. Intake manifold leaks are more common than you might think, and they can be difficult to diagnose. If the leak is between the intake and the cylinder head at the top of the gasket, that's pretty easy to find. But if the leak is down at the bottom of the gasket, then your vacuum leak is coming from the engine valley. Those are obviously difficult to find, and they can cause drivability problems, lean conditions. So we're going to talk about some things we can do to make sure that we install the manifold properly. This car is a 91 5-liter LX. And it just so happens that it had a leak at the back of the intake manifold between the intake and the block, and was leaking a pretty good amount of oil. And we're going to talk about the reason why it was leaking in just a little bit. All right, so as you can see, the intake manifold has already been removed and the gasket surfaces have already been cleaned. One thing you definitely do not want to do when cleaning the gasket surface, especially on aluminum, is use any sort of a air-powered grinder with an abrasive disc. They remove material very, very quickly, and you can make divots in the aluminum pretty quickly, which of course will make it difficult for the gaskets to seal. What you do want to do is just use a gasket scraper. Be very, very careful, because even the gasket scraper can mar up the aluminum. And just take off the worst of it. You don't have to get too fussy with the gasket scraper. You're going to come back later on with just a single straight edge razor blade. And what you want to do is just sort of stand that up on edge like this and just drag it. And if there was any material left on here, you would see that just dragging that razor blade straight up on edge like that, number one, it won't mar the aluminum, and number two, it'll remove almost all of what's left for the gasket material. And then I always follow up with a piece of Scotch-Brite pad. Again, you don't need to go crazy, but a piece of Scotch-Brite will shine this up pretty quickly and remove any little bit of material that's left. So the next thing we want to do is make sure that our gasket sealing surface is flat. And we can do that with a simple straight edge. And we're just going to put it right up against the head and just check and make sure that as we drag it around, we don't see any gaps between the straight edge and your gasket surface. And this one looks good. I like the Felpro Printo Seal gaskets. They have this blue ridge of extra sealant around the ports, just as a little extra insurance in case your surfaces aren't perfectly flat. And what we need to do is we need to make sure that we pick a gasket that has a port size that matches your cylinder heads. We're not looking to match the port size of the intake. What we really want to do is just find a gasket that matches the port size of the cylinder head. So the intake manifold we're going to use is our own design. It is a single plane EFI intake manifold. You can see that the plenum area is pretty large, and you can see that the intake runners are pretty large up at the top, and the runners taper down pretty quickly to a stock size port, and that allows you to use this intake manifold on an engine that has regular road production heads. And then there is a lot of material down around the bottom of the intake runners, so that you can remove quite a bit of material to open up the runners to match up some of the more aggressive heads out there. And what we need to do next is we need to see what, if any, amount of material we need to remove from the intake runners to make them match up to our cylinder heads. So we're going to take our gasket and we're going to lay it up against the intake, and you can see that there's actually quite a bit of difference between the size of the gasket and the ports in the intake. And again, the gasket pretty accurately represents the size of the port in the cylinder head, so we can use the gasket to give us a pretty good idea how much material we need to remove. Okay, so we know that we need to remove some material from the intake. What we don't know at this point is exactly where to remove it. So what we're going to do is take our intake gaskets and put them in place. And we want to line them up with the ports, and that looks good. Now we're going to take our intake manifold and we're going to carefully drop this in place. Let's see if I can do it without banging anything up or moving the gasket around. And that should be good. Okay, so what we're trying to accomplish here is make sure that the gasket is in place against the cylinder head just the way it was when we knew the port lined up. So what we want to do is take a look down through the center runners in the intake manifold. And if you look down through here, you can look down through these 4 center ones, and you can get a good idea how well your gasket is lined up to the cylinder heads. Now if you're careful, it should still be right where you put it before you set the intake in place, but you're going to want to verify that. Just make sure that they didn't move. And once you're sure that the gaskets are where they belong, Then you're going to want to take a look at how the gasket lines up with the intake manifold. And a pretty good point of reference is usually right here on the top edge of the intake. You can see how much the gasket sticks up. You can mark it with a pencil or a pen if you'd like. You know, and it really should be pretty consistent across. You can see that the distance here is in the back is about the same as it is in the front. So I'm pretty confident that right now those gaskets are lined up properly. Now we can remove the intake and the gaskets and go over to the bench. And we're going to use the gasket as a guide to show how much material we need to remove from the intake manifold. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we position the gasket up against the intake manifold just like it was when it was on the car, because what we want to do is make sure that we remove material from the intake manifold in the right spot. So does the gasket end up being, you know, here, 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 here? Where do we actually need to remove the material to make the port size match? So we have two frames of reference. One, of course, is your bolt holes. And so, of course, we want to keep the gasket, you know, left to right, lined up with the bolt holes. And then the other thing we need to consider, of course, is where the gasket goes height-wise. We got that reference when we had the intake and the gaskets on the engine. And if you look at the top edge of the gasket and how it compares to the top edge of the intake, that's going to give you your height. Now, it just so happens in this case that when it's lined up properly, the bottom edge of this gasket happens to be dead even with the bottom edge of the intake manifold. So that's going to be our frame of reference height-wise. So what we want to do is line her up height-wise and left to right. And now you can see exactly where it is you want to remove material from the intake ports. And you can see that on each port, we need to remove some from the bottom edge and the back edge. So we're just going to take a marker. I'm just going to mark it on the intake on all four ports. And now we can see where our material needs to go. Okay, so the way we're going to remove the material from the intake manifold is with this air-powered die grinder with a burring bit on it. And a couple of tricks for you. Keep the tool speed down relatively low. If you run it too fast, the aluminum will warm up and get gummy and it'll stick to the bit. The other thing you can do is warm up the bit a little bit, just a little with a torch, and put some candle wax on it. And the candle wax will help keep the aluminum from sticking to this thing. One other thing is if you do mess up and you run the tool too fast and you get some aluminum stuck in the teeth, you can take a piece of steel, stick it in the vise, grind the piece of steel with this bit a bit, and that will actually remove the aluminum from the bit pretty quickly. And then of course you're going to want to slow your tool down a bit more, and don't forget the candle wax. And the other thing you're going to find on this intake manifold is that you don't need to go down into the port very far. These ports widen out very, very quickly. So really, if you go up into the port, you know, you take your bit and you remove material up to your line. And of course, you want to take the line off. Your line is inside of the gasket opening, of course. You want to go in enough to just remove the line, and then you want to go into the port a bit just to make a nice smooth flare. And really, probably 3/4 of an inch in is plenty. Okay, so this is the intake manifold we actually took off the engine. It's already been ported. And you can see, if we take the gasket and line it up, there we go. You can see that the ports on this intake manifold have been opened up to match the gasket. And you can also see how far we went in. And in this case, 5/8 of an inch, maybe, we went in, just so that you've got a nice blend. Obviously what you don't want to do is just cut a bunch off of this edge and then, just have this sharp radius here. You're going to want to remove a little material inside here too, so that you've got a smooth path for the airflow. And this intake is ready to be put on. All right, so let's talk about some of the things that went wrong with the installation of this intake manifold the first time around and the reasons we took it off. The first thing we found wrong is the leak at the back of the intake manifold where it was leaking oil. And what we found is these Velcro gaskets come with an adhesive on the bottom side. And it's a great idea in theory, the idea being that you can stick the gasket to the block and it should stay in place while you're working and setting your intake in place. The problem is that the adhesive melted, and I'm not sure if it was engine heat or the oil, but whatever the reason, the adhesive between the plastic and the gasket melted away. And when we pulled the intake manifold off, you could see that we had good crush. I mean, the gasket was certainly crushed between the intake and the block, but this film had worked its way loose from both the block and the gasket, and quite a bit of oil was actually running between there. So what I did is, what I did here, I peeled the paper off, and then if you take a razor blade and get up underneath the edge, you can get underneath the film. You can actually peel this film off from the gasket if you're careful. And then the adhesive that was left behind, I just washed off with some lacquer thinner. Then you want to get these gaskets glued in place with some RTV silicone and walk away for a while. The RTV takes about 12 hours to dry, so you'll want to stick these gaskets in place and let the RTV dry, come back later on when they won't slide around on you. One thing I like to do is I like to trim these tabs on the end of the block gasket. That tab is intended to go into this slot on the intake gasket. They tend to be a little long, and they tend to make the edge of the gasket stick up when you set it in place. So what I do is I will take a razor blade and I will cut that on an angle that'll match the angle of the cylinder head. And now when we put this on the block, we have an angle here that matches the head, and we've still got some tab left to hold things in place. The other thing I found wrong is, and this is very common, people will put RTV silicone on this gasket, and they'll either put it around all of the intake ports or over the entire thing, or sometimes they'll just put it around the water jacket, and the idea is a little extra insurance to prevent the leak. You don't want to do that. The problem with that is, you can see here, this gasket had RTV silicone just around the water ports. And you can see, here's the gasket we took off. Here is the gasket where it goes around one of the intake ports. You can see that it's still nice and rectangular shaped. But if you look at the ends, again, there was RTV around here, and it was only on the back side. They didn't put it in here. And you can see this edge of the intake port is all distorted, and the reason for that is when they tighten the intake gasket down with the wet RTV in place, the RTV acts as a lubricant. When the intake manifold is being tightened down, it's squeezing this gasket, and it actually, because it's slippery and there's no friction here, it'll actually cause it to expand and distort. So, we went through that work to port our intake manifold and make our intake match our heads, but then we're going to block it off partially with this gasket by having it squish and expand out into the opening. RTV should really never be used on an intake manifold gasket. You can use it down on the wall between the block and the underside of the intake, that's fine. But you definitely don't want to use it on the side gaskets, and for two reasons. One, what I just showed, and two, the fuel flowing through the intake ports will actually eat away the RTV. And if you didn't have a leak when you started, you certainly will once that RTV is eaten away. So never, never, never use RTV silicone on an intake gasket. This is actually the reason I like to use the Felpro gasket. Your little extra blue seal here will give you that insurance that you're looking for to make sure that you've got a good seal if you don't have a perfect surface. Okay, so we talked about the oil leak at the back of the intake manifold. There's really two ways we could solve that problem. One would be to be what I described, where we take the plastic off from the bottom of the gasket and wash the adhesive off with some lacquer thinner. And you can see we trimmed the corners so that the gasket fits up against the angle of the cylinder head, so that the gasket fits in there nice. So anyway, method one again would be to do what we talked about, where we're going to use this gasket. The other would be to eliminate the gasket altogether, and what you could do is you could just simply pile up a pretty good bead of silicone, right across the block from point A to point B. Make sure you put a little extra right here in the corners. It's just a place where the gasket, can't get in there very well, so a little extra RTV is some insurance. So if you're not going to use the gasket, again, you would just pile up a pretty tall bead here. Make sure it's high enough that when you put the intake manifold in place that you crush that silicone and get a good seal. I honestly don't care for that method, only because you can mess up that bead of silicone when you're putting the intake in place and create a leak. If you're careful, it works fine. I personally like to use the gasket. So you can see we've already gone ahead and done that. And what you want to do, a little extra right here in the corners, a small bead across here if you're going to use the gasket. Push the gasket down in place, really give it, push it down in there and spread the silicone around. Make sure the gasket is in place where you want it, and then walk away. Felpro's idea of putting adhesive on the gasket was a good one, in that you'll find when you tighten the intake manifold down, these gaskets tend to crush and squirt out of place. So the adhesive obviously was designed to hold them there. So we're doing sort of the same thing here. We're just using RTV instead of their glue. The problem is, of course, that RTV dries pretty slowly. So if we're going to do this, we need to put the gasket in place, and we need to walk away for about 12 hours and let that RTV set up so that they'll stay in place when we're tightening our intake down. All right, so we're about ready to put the intake in place. One thing we want to do, take a paper towel with a little brake clean and just do a final wash on your surfaces. There's going to be some oily residue left behind, and this will take it right off. And you can see paper towel gets pretty dirty, so we're actually accomplishing something here. And we want to do the same on the intake manifold. That's already been done. And then we're going to want to take some silicone, and we want to put just a little bead. I'm going to put a little extra in the corner here again, and then a nice even bead right across the top of the gasket, and again a little extra right in there. Same in the back. A little blop in the corner. Nice even bead across the back, a little extra in the corner again. All right, you can see the way this gasket is made. This little part here actually blocks off the water port. So let's just cut it out of there. A pair of wire cutters will work pretty well for that. And we're going to set it in place. Set this gasket in place. And again, I'm going to put just a little extra silicone in here, just in case. And now it's time to set our intake in place. All right, so once you got the intake settled down into place, you want to take your bolts and drop them in. Just thread those things down in there. We're not going to tighten them. We're not even going to begin to tighten them. In fact, I really don't want the heads of the bolts even touching the intake manifold just yet. Oh. I just want to get them started so that everything's in place. Okay, so next we want to do is make sure that everything's lined up properly. We want to make sure that our gasket is lined up. And I'm just going to take a look down through the intake ports and make sure that the intake lines up with the head. Looks like my gasket is just a bit high on this side, so I'm going to push it down a little. Looks good over here. Looks good front to back. There we go. So that looks good on that side. Okay, so now we're looking through this side. Everything over here appears to be lined up pretty good as well. You can see that the port is lined up with the port on the head. The other thing I like to do is just, have a look at the top of the gasket is lined up on the top edge, so the top of the intake manifold looks pretty consistent. And this looks pretty good. Okay, so this is important. We want to make sure that we tighten up the bolts properly. And the mistake that I see people make often is they'll open up a book and they will look up the tightening sequence and the torque spec, and they'll start on bolt number 1 and they'll just crank this thing down. And what happens when you do that, you're going to push this side of the intake down, you're going to lift this side of the intake up, then you go over to the other side and you tighten this bolt, and you never really get this side down where it belongs. And that could potentially cause a leak. We really just want to put the bolts in so that the heads are just touching the intake manifold, leaving it loose enough that we can move it, line up our gaskets. And once that's done, now we want to just very gradually start tightening these bolts. And I mean just a little bit on one side, just a little bit on the other side. And we're going to go in a crisscross pattern, back and forth. And I can't stress enough, you can't do too many tightening sequences. There's no such thing as doing this too many times. So don't be afraid to turn this into several tightening sequences. Okay, now you're going to find when you come back to the middle bolt, look at this thing, it's loose. It's actually loose again. So same thing, back and forth. Can you see that bolt move? See that bolt wiggle? That's actually loose again. So again, just a little bit, snug it up. Back and forth in a crisscross pattern. I'm going to come back to our first one again. It's loose again. What's happening is we're tightening the bolts. We tighten the middle one, and then we work our way out, and we're compressing the gasket. And as we do that, we're making these bolts loose again. But what we know, doing it this way, is that we're tightening the intake manifold evenly. And we're not going to kick the intake crooked. So I've gone around 3 times now. Look at that bolt is still getting loose. I don't know if you can see it move or not. You can see the head wiggling back and forth. That bolt is still loose. So let's go around again, and we can starting to tighten it a bit more now. We've gone around 3 times. We're on our 4th time now. We can start to tighten it a bit now. At this point, we really shouldn't be able to kick the intake manifold crooked anymore. Right about now is when you'd want to get out your torque wrench. It's not necessary to be screwing around with the torque wrench through the beginning of the sequence, but after going around 4 or 5 times, again, we're going to come back and this is going to be pretty loose, but not as loose anymore. This would be a good time to get out your torque wrench and torque it down to factory specs if you're using factory heads. If you're using aftermarket heads, you might want to look and see what the head manufacturer recommends, but this would be the time to get out your torque wrench and start tightening these down. And you want to keep going through that pattern, again, left to right, back and forth, front to back. You really don't have to follow the factory sequence as long as you make sure you go back and forth and crisscross. As long as you do it in a pattern like that, work your way from the middle out in both directions, you're going to be fine. And you're done. You're done tightening the bolts down when you can tighten the middle ones, tighten them to the torque spec, go all the way out to the outside corners, and then come back again. And when you get to the middle bolts, you get on them with the torque wrench, and they're still torqued down the right amount. When you come back to the middle and you put the torque wrench on there and you've got to tighten it some more before the torque wrench clicks, you're not done. You need to do one more pattern and come back, and you're done when you can put the torque wrench on there and you go to tighten it, the bolt doesn't move and the torque wrench clicks. That's when you're done. Okay, so our intake is installed. We've torqued the bolts down. When we go back to the middle ones, they're staying tight. So that's when we know that we're done. One last thing, after the engine is all back together and you've had it running and you've gotten it good and hot and letting it cool down, and we're talking about, you know, a good hour-long ride, shut it down and let it sit overnight, you're going to want to come back the next morning and retighten those intake bolts. The cylinder heads will have expanded. That's going to crush the intake gaskets, and those bolts will be loose again. So you want to do exactly the same thing we did when we first installed it. Start in the middle, crisscross back and forth, make your way from the middle out to the outside corners, and you're done when you can come back to the center bolt and it's still as tight as it was when you left it. And use the torque wrench. So again, once those center bolts are staying tight, you're done. You should be good to go. You shouldn't have to check it anymore, and we shouldn't have any leaks.